we, as human beings, are not as rational as we think we are. So we all have these what's called the cognitive biases, which make our thinking kind of shortcuts. We find shortcuts to our thinking. And the most prominent, especially in information and news consumption, is the confirmation bias, that we seek out information that confirms our beliefs. So on the supply side, that zooms into exactly what they find, because they know us better than we do, especially on social media, and then they keep feeding drip the kind of news that they want us to believe.
This panel today is going to be talking about some of the themes of our class. And I'm so excited to be joined with our panelists today. So today we have Philip Martin, who is the Senior Investigative Reporter for GBH News Center for Investigative Reporting. Joining us from Brussels on Zoom, we have Tina Zernatsky, who is the head of unit for communication from the European Commission's Directorate General, the head of unit for communication and the European Commission's Directorate General for Migration and Home Affairs. And Jonas Kaiser, who is an assistant professor for communication, journalism, and media here at Suffolk University. He's also at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard for Internet and Society. I want to talk a little bit about why thinking about bullshit matters. So Susan really helpfully centered this in terms of Harry Frankfurt's little stocking stuffer book on bullshit, which came out, I think, like 2002, something like that. Harry Frankfurt describes bullshit as speech where the speaker doesn't care whether what they're saying is true or false. I think that's really useful. I want to center thinking about this in terms of knowledge. So most of the knowledge we don't have independently. We don't have it by our own devices. Philosophers have been kind of slow to figure this out. Philosophers historically focus on knowledge that we do have via our own devices, via observation, via memory, via inference. But we also gain a lot of knowledge from others through testimony, through hearing from them, right? Not testimony in the court of law sense, right? When you're on the witness stand, but testimony in the everyday sense of hearing about things through others where they were at a place at a time when we weren't. We learn through that kind of testimony. No man is an island, right? So just some everyday examples. You hear from a friend that Purdue University lost the basketball game last night in an upset. From Bloomington, Indiana, so I really care that Purdue lost the game, right? You learn who the person of interest is in a mass shooting through investigative reporting, right? On cable news, say. You learn that the unemployment rate edged up to 3.6% in February from an announcement by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Or you learn that smoking causes cancer from a scientific record that is composed of a diffuse set of researchers across time and space, right? The scientific record is not just one thing, right? It's composed of all of these different researchers, right? All of these different observations across time and space. These are all very different sources, and they're all very different claims, but they have something in common. Because speakers typically care about being accurate, because they typically care about being credible, trustworthy, reliable, sincere, honest, and so on, we're typically justified in believing such claims on the basis of testimony. There's something cool about that. There's something really important about that. We don't have to rely on just ourselves to gain knowledge about the world, right? We don't just have to rely on observation, memory, inference, again, these practices that we have merely from our own devices. We can depend on other people and learn things from other people via language. So enter bullshit. Again, bullshit when somebody doesn't care about whether what they're saying is true or false. Imagine a friend who doesn't know or care who actually won the game. News outlets who are uninterested in whether they've actually identified the correct person who was the person of interest in the shooting. Or a government agency that jukes the stats, right, for unemployment. A quote-unquote scientific record where one claim is just as good as its opposite, right? So one reason that bullshit matters is because it erodes credibility, trust, reliability, sincerity, accuracy, honesty. It's socially corrosive. That seems obvious. But it's also epistemically destructive, where epistemology has to do with knowledge, justification, warrant, evidence, right? It undermines the case for justification, what we can treat as true, take to be true, rely on. In a world of bullshitters, we're not prima facie justified in believing claims via testimony. And that is what I think is really troubling and troublesome. At least it troubles me. Because if knowledge via testimony isn't justified, and I think like typically we treat it as though it's justified. And but if it's not, if knowledge via testimony isn't justified, you're kind of on your own. So that's kind of what we've been thinking about in our class. And that's why I wanted to bring together our panelists here to talk today. Maybe we can go ahead and start our discussion. So maybe a couple questions to start off, and then we can open up to questions from our class. Does that sound okay? Okay, great. So maybe one question to start off with. It seems like there's both kind of a supply side and a demand side to bullshit. That is, there's like advertisers, snake oil salesmen, influencers, podcasters on the supply side, but there's also like social media audiences, cable TV viewers on the demand side. How should we be thinking about both sides of this relationship? So Jonas, do you want to start?
Sure. Happy to. I mean, that's kind of like the hard one, right? Like where basically the idea is, I guess, who's to blame for the amount of bullshit in the media ecosystem? And the idea of a supply side is, of course, as you just said, that there is kind of like this incentive structure that allows, for example, influencers, but also, like weird websites, social media companies, or, Fox News, etc., kind of like is incentivized to just like, don't care for the facts, because the idea is that the audience and the money that brings is more important than whatever you can actually bring to the table, right? Like we're seeing this playing out right now in front of court with Fox News versus Dominion. But of course, at the other hand, right, like you have the audience, and we are, as users, as people, notoriously bad at understanding what's good for us. Right? With that, I mean that if we have the chance, we will always click on the things that are more sensationalized, that are more unbelievable, that are more negative, right? And by doing so, we obviously also kind of like contribute to kind of like this never-ending kind of like circle where basically we show, for example, social media companies that we really enjoy some form of content, and they reward that with the content creators through ad money, and they will consistently do more of the same, right? And so my sense is kind of like that we really need to focus more on accountability, right? Like that we say, well, who is actually accountable for kind of like creating this content, to kind of like make it about actually the people that create these messages, that create or enforce the spread or incentivize the spread.
Yeah. I cover extremism largely these days. I've covered a lot of things, including human trafficking. And in the context of this question of supply and demand, I'm seeing a lot of the disinformation, the bullshit, reciprocally expressed in politics. You take, for example, in recent days, the popular governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, made a comment that's fairly striking in the context of bullshit. and it is that he described this pandemic, which just took several tens of thousands of lives, called it a woke pandemic. Well, we know the term woke is largely a dog whistle these days. It's a term that can mean anything, what it in terms of awareness and so on and so forth. But what he meant to say was that it's not as bad as we thought it was, even though we're looking at over 1 million lives lost in the United States from the coronavirus. He was suggesting that there was somehow or another the politics of the virus was worse than the actual impact of the virus. We know that not to be true. And so but at the same time, there's a symbiotic relationship that he has with his audience. Some people who support the governor do not believe that the situation was as bad as promulgated and as stated in media, and thus tend to believe and want to believe that it was perhaps the politics of the virus that was more potent than the virus itself. And that is a problematic assessment. But you do see this symbiotically express the supply side and the demand side, those who want to see that it wasn't so bad, and those who benefit from the promulgation of that line, that it was a woke virus, as opposed to, or woke pandemic is the term he used, as opposed to the actual impact. Plato advanced years ago this notion of the theory of ideas, which you probably know of. It formed the basis of this thing we call objective reality. And simply speaking, he suggested that the sky is the sky, a rock is a rock, so on and so forth. But we're at a point in our nation's evolution, if we want to call it that, where a rock is no longer a rock. For many people, the rock is the sky. And an acceptance of an alternate reality, an alternate fact, an alternate truth, alternate fact, as former President Trump's advisor once said, Kellyanne Conway, in describing what was acceptable for many within her orbit. She advanced the notion that we can have alternate facts. She was referencing the inauguration of the President Trump. You probably remember this, when Sean Spicer, the first communications director or communications spokesperson for the Trump administration, looked out on the audience of thousands, tens of thousands that were attending President Trump's inauguration, and said it was bigger than anything we had seen before, and so on and so forth. But again, a rock is a rock. But in this case with Sean Spicer, a rock was the sky. He, with his own naked eyes, in our own naked eyes, we could see that it was not the largest inauguration of ever, but it was one of more than 30,000 lies, according to the Washington Post, that former President Trump said up until 2021, over the course of his administration. It's one of 30,000 lies uttered by the former president in contravention to truth. And reason it played so well is because it satisfied the desires, the perceptions of many of his constituents. And so, albeit this was an out-and-out lie, that it was not, it did not conform to objective reality. It fit for many people the reality that they wanted. It was an alternate, as Kellyanne Conway said, an alternate truth, an alternate fact, an alternate truth and an alternate fact that simply was untrue.
Thanks. Tina, thoughts about supply and demand?
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks to Philip for raising Plato, so I don't have to raise, because I'm Greek, so I always have to start with the Greeks, But this time, I leave it to others to talk about universal truth, even though I think the relativist truth might have won out, as Philip said. So just to go back a little bit to why misinformation and disinformation are, why are they there, or why on the supply side, Jonas mentioned the commercial aspect of it, when people are making money, and Philip mentioned more the political aspect, because there's a political strategy behind it. So we do need to make that distinction, and also the distinction between mis and disinformation. Disinformation being intentional, whereas misinformation is when we simply don't know that what we're saying, is wrong. So what I'd like to focus is on the supply side, rather on the demand side, rather than the supply side, on the fact that we as human beings are not as rational as we think we are. So we all have these what's called the cognitive biases, which make our thinking kind of shortcuts. We find shortcuts to our thinking. And the most prominent, especially in information and news consumption, is the confirmation bias, that we seek out information that confirms our beliefs. So on the supply side, that zooms into exactly what they find, because they know us better than we do, especially on social media, and then they keep feeding drip the kind of news that they want us to believe. So this is a real danger of how disinformation is exploiting these human, let's say, weaknesses of the brains, these errors. And from my perspective, I mean, it's hard to, there's no easy fix, obviously, but I think awareness of what this is doing to us is one element in terms of our understanding that we are being manipulated in this way online. And then something that we have been trying in my area of work is the inoculation theory, which, just like in medical theory, if you do also provide small, or rather, if you try to create a safe environment where you can provide small snippets of the truth repeatedly, you can create some psychological resistance, and people becoming more attuned to and more critical to what they see. So these are the ways that we can see coming out of this, but it's not easy, and it takes a lot of effort.
Yeah, that's great, Tina. So that's really helpful, this point about confirmation bias. I think it also really aligns with what Philip was saying, or what I took Philip to be saying, about alternate facts or alternative facts being kind of expressions of wishful thinking, preferences, desires, or projections.
Frames of reference,
Yeah.
And not just interpretations.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right, preferences.
Yeah, you kind of see what you want
That's
to
right,
see, right?
precisely.
Yeah.
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 And I mean, you can think about it even in historical terms. We have this debate that's happening in the country right now. It should not be a debate, but it is a debate, and the debates are fine if you're debating facts, if you're willing to debate truth. But when you have someone, for example, positing, and right now you have an entire movement where people are positing that this notion of critical race theory is somehow an attempt to demean white people, well, that makes no sense. Critical race theory is a framework for analyzing law, and perhaps it is something that those of you in the room have come across already or have used. It is not, but if you can interpret it as anti-white, then that becomes that becomes a powerful tool for those who would like to see historical attacks on historical racial attacks, racial assaults. If you see the country as one where race plays no central role historically, then you are willing to accept a notion that critical race theory is something that is tantamount to anti-whiteness, as opposed to a way of looking at history and looking at legal systems and understanding the centrality of race and institutional racism in our country's formation and in our historical history. It becomes in the hands of those who would like to see it as a political weapon, it becomes more than just a debate. It becomes a lie. If you decide to not to debate, critical race theory can be debated if you're talking about critical race theory. But if you substitute something else and call it, if you say, for example, critical race theory is being taught in elementary schools, well, that's nonsense. Of course that's nonsense. It's, if you know what critical race theory is. If you say that critical race theory is anti-white, well, that makes no sense either. Its formation, was not formed as an anti-white analysis. It was formed as a way of looking at race critically, and it's foundational of aspects when it comes to law, and when it comes to history. But it's being taken to mean even the teaching of American history, which is when you start to look at its critical aspects, the centrality, again, of race in the formation of the Republic, so on and so forth. And if that's seen as non-existent for some people who have looked at the issue of critical race theory and said that race has not played a central role in this country's history, its formation, or its legal foundations. And I think the debate is fine, again, when you are debating, but when you in fact offer made up information for expediency's sake, just totally make it up out of thin air, then that's a whole different matter. The debate is great. I love old-fashioned debates. What I don't like is when you substitute lies for truth.
Jonas, do you have thoughts on this?
Yes, right? Like, so this is very much or it seems to be for me very much on the supply side, right? Like a very cynical use of bullshit, or to kind of like use Tina's terms, mis and disinformation, right? Like where mis and disinformation is much more like centered around the idea of either people knowingly or unknowingly promoting falsehoods. And kind of like, like when you were talking about woke, right? Like I think the latest thing that is allegedly woke is the Silicon Valley Bank, apparently,
right.
Which is apparently to, like the woke part is to blame for, like the bank doing very risky banky things, which have nothing to do with woke, but, like I guess that, would have saved us from like the 2008 financial crisis, maybe. And this kind of like connects more, this whole woke thing, critical race theory thing, connects also to, of course, like this idea that everything that you don't like is socialism or communism or Marxism or cultural Marxism, right? Like all of kind of like these concepts that are not understood or at best ill understood, and then kind of like leveled against opponents to kind of like just like other them, right? Like based on something that is identified as like bad/evil. And like I think woke in that context is just like the latest thing in kind of like this campaign to other positions to, like denigrate like ideas and positions that are worthwhile thinking, and to kind of like, like bring this under a very cynical political campaign banner, right? Like, because the idea here is not to discuss, for example, like the shortcomings of Silicon Valley Bank and whether deregulation under the Trump presidency had something to do with that or not, which is also totally possible. but rather kind of like to find a culprit that apparently is to blame for everything that is currently wrong in this country. Right? Like, and that is something that we not only see in the US, but we can see this in Europe, we can see this worldwide. Right? Like, you can see this also, for example, when you look at Russia's communication strategy. Right? Like, and kind of like who's to blame actually for, I guess, Russia's attack on Ukraine. Right? And so I think there's kind of like a clear political element to the use of mis and disinformation, of bullshit, to further one's own goal, regardless of kind of like how this is being received by the audience.
Yeah, so it seems like bullshit plays an important role in mainstreaming extremism, right? So this is something that we've talked about before. So in Europe, populist movements on both the right and the left have grown in strength by use of bullshit to mainstream their ideas. In the like anti-vax conspiracy theories might be a good example here. In the US, election denial is not a fringe belief among GOP voters. About 70% of Republicans still say they suspect election fraud, that Joe Biden was not the legitimate winner of the 2020 presidential election. But so thinking about your areas and experience, and I also want to bring Tina in here. I'm wondering about what roles different organizations and intermediaries can and should play here. In particular for Tina, I'm maybe wondering about the Digital Services Act. If you want to speak to that, you were talking a little bit about inoculation theory. I mean, there's a lot that's going on here. I don't know if you want to speak to some of this stuff.
Sure. Thanks. Just to go back to what Jonas was saying about Russian disinformation, because we've been looking at it a lot in the last few years, and what I'm going to say about the actions that we took is to a large extent based on the study of how Russian disinformation was and is working, which is to not to advance one, let's say, bullshit, but many bullshit theories. So about the same event, they might have 5, 6, 10 different interpretations. And what this does, it floods the area, it floods the information, and in the end, what it creates is a complete confusion on the demand or the person who gets the information, and complete distrust that anything that they hear can be right. So this is exactly what they want, this total confusion, which leads to the distrust, and then that also often distrust, high levels of distrust can lead to radicalization. And you have the critical race theory. We have the great replacement theory, which I think is also echoed in the US. It's a white supremacist theory that says that there is this elite conspiracy to replace all citizens in Europe, all white native citizens, with Muslim migrants. And because I work in the migration area, you can imagine that this theory, which sounds completely absurd, has influenced so much of the extreme right-wing politicians in Europe that we don't see them actually repeating the whole, let's say, theory itself, but different parts of it. And it has changed politics, it has changed the whole attitude towards migration, and it has changed elections, and making it even harder for us to deal with the issues of increasing migration trends into Europe. But to go back to what we are doing in the European Union, for the last several years, we've had an action plan against disinformation. And this action plan looks at various aspects of society, from civil society to governments, to media literacy. But I think the most groundbreaking aspect of it was a code of conduct that was made as a self-regulatory tool for the big platforms to take action. And we in the EU did not tell them what kind of action, but they were responsible to take action for the disinformation and misinformation that was found on their platforms, and then to report back to us. After several years of this way of working, the limits of the self-regulation were evident, and this is why now the EU has approved a more, let's say, powerful piece of legislation, this Digital Services Act, which seems it's going to enter into force next year, and it seems like it's the tool now that we have to make platforms, especially the very big platforms, which are particularly made accountable for what is going on their on these platforms. So it makes platforms more accountable, protects people, it protects minors, it protects people from certain types of targeting that is possible, targeting according to sexual orientation, targeting minors, targeting ethnic, targeting all these different kind of targeting where you can get information based on your profile. So this is where we at. We have big hopes that this legislation is going to change, or at least make platforms more accountable. To be seen if this is going to make a big dent, because different ways are always being, let's say, invented, and sometimes legislation is always kind of running behind the newest trends. So with AI now, God knows what else it's going to be difficult to regulate.
Awesome, thank you, Tina. I think we're going to take a couple student questions now, if that's okay. Okay, so Mary, do you want to ask your question? Do we need to mic her? Give us 1 second. Yeah.
That's what just in the interim.
Sorry.
No, just in the interim. I was just thinking what Tina was just saying. In Europe, of course, you have a lot more. In many ways, you have many more formidable ways of attacking disinformation because the laws are so different, particularly within European EU countries. Particularly, for example, in Germany, when it comes to extremism and so on and so forth. We are far, of course, more willing, because the basis of our law, our Constitution, is very different than the laws of Germany, particularly after the World War II. But I was thinking that there are some things which I think folks fail to understand, of course, in the context of First Amendment law, which is that it is not wide open. You cannot, the notion, I think you all know this, the notion of screaming fire in a crowded theater is not something that's permissible.
It is. It is legal.
Is it legal?
It is legal, yes. That is a common trope. Just for the interest of kind of like a panel on bullshit, we probably should call it. It is actually.
You can scream fire in a crowded theater. This was Felix.
It was later talked. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, that's misinformation. Well, thank you very much. I didn't know that. That's interesting, because I know in Germany, though, there are strict laws against right-wing extremism, especially in regard to Nazism and the legacy of Nazism. One of the points I wanted to make is that you do find efforts when you even though the laws are very different, you find efforts to counter it through data, which is very, very important. And one example would be at Brigham and Women's Hospital last year, a neo-Nazi group picketed. You may remember this story, if those of you who were around here. They picketed outside the hospital, declaring that any attempt to establish equity in healthcare was anti-white. They were echoing a statement that had been made a week earlier by President Trump at a rally in Arizona. And what the hospital tried to do, Mass Brigham, was to establish data to show that you did, in fact, have inequitable outcomes in cardiac and neurological care at the hospital. And their effort was attempting to balance, to create equity in those areas where you saw imbalances in healthcare. But this, again, was something that was described as anti-white. Institutionally, to your point, it was important that the hospitals basically played a role in establishing the data. The data didn't lie. Mm-hmm. That was, and that's true also for journalists in the context of stories about any number of things, that in addition to eyewitness testimony, it's so important to establish data-determined facts, such that some points become incontrovertible. Truth becomes incontrovertible. You can tell, you can say, I don't believe it. That might be one thing, but the data is so important. And so I just want to give a point to the efforts by MG. I keep wanting to call it MGH, but of course the name has changed some time ago. It's MGB, Mass Brigham, and the efforts by that hospital and other health institutions to generate data in order to contravene what is often misinformation.
Good.
Or disinformation.
Good. So making data transparent and public
Yes.
as a mechanism for responding.
Very important.
That's great. Mary, do you want to ask your question? We're going to go to student questions now. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely.
Hi, Mary. Thank you for being here.
Is it on?
Hi. Thank you all for being here. My question is, have you had any personal experience with falling for or engaging with bullshit in an unconstructive way? And what did you learn from that experience about bullshit? And I guess like also how aware you were of the fact that it was bullshit.
Great question. I'm trying to think of put me on the spot.
I mean, calling fire in a crowded theater. I mean, we just had like a moment.
Yeah,
of
we just
it
had a moment.
now,
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good example. I mean, because it's a well-known assumption. We have to now put it within that category that there were exceptions to the freedom of speech, freedom of expression, First Amendment law, and that the exception we assumed was calling fire in a crowded theater. This came from, I forgot the exact case. If anyone remember this, but this reached the Supreme Court, and so and thank you for that admonition. So I guess that would be an example. There have been other examples, but I think what the purpose of having good editors and copy editors in newsroom is that you don't fall for that. I'm sure there have been times, in fact, without question, there have been times when I've been fed information that turned out to be not true, and that's the whole point of fact checking. It's the whole point of organizations that fact check on a much broader scale, like PolitiFact in this country, or Snopes, or any number of groups that basically do fact checking, so that we don't fall for misinformation, as Tina defined.
Good. So the division of labor within newsrooms
Yes,
is really important.
it's
there.
very important.
And within organizations more broadly.
Yeah, and it's one of the problems that's happening today, of course, is on the local level, where local newspapers are going out of business, or being or basically being dismantled, and it's so important that they continue to exist, because they serve as fact checkers.
Yeah.
And when those newspapers are demolished in terms of personnel, and you have one or two people left, that's problematic. because you desperately need good editors. That's why you have groups like Ground Truth Project, a grassroots organization in the country that's attempting to place reporters in local newsrooms around the country through something called Report for America.
Awesome. So I'm going to remind our panelists to keep answers short.
Absolutely.
Sorry. Okay. Jonas and Tina, personal relationships with bullshit.
Yeah, every day. We actually look at all the disinformation. For instance, now we're looking at what is happening with Ukrainian refugees. There's more than 4 million Ukrainians right now in Europe that are protected by law and given access to healthcare, residence, education, jobs. And we were kind of waiting to see when the disinformation would start. It started quite early, accusing them of, usually for refugees, what it is, it's they make accusations that they're coming to take our money, to bring crime. Sometimes when they're not Europeans, that they will change our identity. So we've been monitoring this, and we look at all the different disinformation that is usually in more niche areas, but sometimes gets into more mainstream media. So it's very important that we look at it before it gets big. So what I'd like to say is that it's often the case that we look at a piece of news, and in that obvious disinformation, there's a nugget of truth around which they've built another story or a completely different interpretation. So that makes it difficult, because we are very keen to uphold the freedom of speech, of course, in the EU, like in the US. And you have to make the distinction. Is it an opinion? Is it a very subjective reality? Or is it just pure bullshit? So this is something, it's a bit of a, and then you have to do some fact checking. You have to exercise some critical judgment to at the end of the day, and also to see what the intention is, because that's really what makes it makes you decide whether it is indeed a disinformation or a misinformation.
Just to answer your question, constantly, right? Like I'm online, as most of you, constantly, and thus exposed to bullshit constantly, right? And I think it's always easy to spot the bullshit that we disagree with, right? Because we do disagree with, and we're just like inherently more likely to be skeptical of things that we disagree with, rather than, as Tina said earlier, kind of like just engage our confirmation bias and just like be like, oh yeah, that sounds about right, right? Of course they would say that, or something like that, right? And so I think the key thing, bring it back more on the academic thing, is kind of like being very much aware where you are, and kind of like that wherever you are, be that Instagram, be that TikTok, be that Facebook. I know most of you are not on Facebook really anymore, or or Twitter, or any other platform, that you are constantly embedded in kind of like communication operation campaigns that basically aim to kind of like change your opinions in one way or the other, right? That can be fandoms that want to push something, hashtag release the Snyder Cut, etc., right? Or that can be something else entirely and more nefarious, right? Like, but basically there's constantly bullshit, and it's just like important to remind us again and again and again that we are not kind of like prone to that we're just not immune to that, but rather that we should be skeptic regarding what we see online, if it's not a trustworthy source.
Yeah, great. So we're going to go to audience questions now. So we're going to do both from our online audience and here in person. So I've got a couple from our online audience here. So maybe I'll start with one from the online audience, and then we'll go to the in-person audience, if that sounds okay. So the one from the online audience that I have that I think is really great here. How can we address identity politics from the entire ideological spectrum when claims by opposing tribes are dismissed as BS? That's one. And then how can the monetary incentives for media outlets in spreading BS be addressed? That's 2. Jonas, do you want to start? And then maybe we'll go to Tina.
Sure, those are 2 very, those are,
Look, they're written there.
okay, thank you. So I think the first one, right, like identity politics, and I think that's important that basically you kind of like have to take a step back and kind of like think about like, how do we solve this? And I think the biggest issue or the biggest aspect that I would advocate for is that we can't solve bullshit, right? We can't solve the idea that there will never be falsehoods anymore. Mm-hmm. What we have to kind of like change and understand is that a very real problem is that these falsehoods are used to create a collective identity, right? For political parties, for specific movements, and that basically these falsehoods are instrumental for these movements, right? An extreme example, but like neo-Nazis, right? You can't be a neo-Nazi without believing in bullshit, right? Like that's core to that belief, because if you just like engage with facts, as Philip highlighted, right? Like you wouldn't be, right? Like because most of your beliefs are terrible and based on, unfounded realities or facts, right? So I think, again, this goes back to what I said at the start, that there needs to be something more akin to accountability for, like people being responsible and accountable for what they say, going back to journalism and basically journalists calling out, arguments or calls that are like made in bad faith, right? Like that basically there needs to be more engagement with like, what is the motive here? That there needs to be more engagement with kind of like, is this just like for the identity, or is this really like, as you said, kind of like a debate? With regard to the second question about monetary incentives, right? Like I think being more transparent, as for example the DSA, as Tina highlighted, about kind of like what goes into algorithms, what are the outcomes of algorithms, right? Like where does ad money go? Who is allowed to target which communities is already a big part of kind of like this equation. Being more, again, also legally accountable for spreading falsehoods is a key part, right? Like what's happening with Fox News right now, right? Like where basically no one there believed that the election was stolen, and yet kind of like they brought people on who did kind of like propose that the election was stolen, right? Like there needs to be some form of legal accountability here, because like otherwise, well, we've got a problem.
So important, legal accountability.
Tina, do you have thoughts on these?
Yeah, on the monetization, I think it's key, and as long as the purveyors of disinformation make money from that, either by advertising or placing disinformation, through clickbait, then they're just gonna keep making money. So it's very important to stop that connection of selling disinformation or selling misinformation, for that matter, also, and to make money. And this is at the core of the Digital Services Act, as Jonas said. And it's something that we have also been working on in the last few years with platforms. And I can tell you that they made a lot of progress during COVID, because these were life and death situations. If you put a false advertisement for a cure of COVID, just to get clicks to something else, then that's almost criminal. So a lot of that we were able to curtail and make platforms report back on a monthly basis about what they were doing. And I think it worked once you make them more accountable. And the numbers were astounding of how many accounts they either removed or stopped amplifying, because sometimes it's as simple as that. You can allow people to, publish the bullshit, but if you keep amplifying it, because that's what platforms do, then you allow more people to see it and to believe it, and that's at the core of the problem of the role of the platforms, and why it's so important that they take responsibility and accountability. And as we say, freedom of speech is not freedom of reach, and that's what the platforms are doing.
Real quick.
As quick as I can. All right. First of all, your point about being accountable is important. One good example is Alex Jones, who is now being held accountable if they can, in fact, stop him from using his money in a bankruptcy. Trying to hide his money within a bankruptcy court. But Alex Jones is a good example, who basically said that children at Sandy Hook had staged their own, had staged the killings there. Total nonsense. But it hurt a lot of people. One of the things I would say about identity politics is this. You have to define identity politics. If identity politics is only defined as LGBTQ, Black, Latino, and not white nationalism, then that's a problem. And many people do not see white nationalism as an identity politic. In fact, it's rarely even recognized as white nationalism. So that's very important.
Yeah, great. So we want to take a couple questions from the audience. So raise your hands. Yeah, so let's one in the back and then some.
I just want to say thank you guys so much for talking about the issue of bullshit today. I appreciate it. My name is Reese Holt. I am a master's student getting my degree in global public policy. And my question for the panel is, in academia and the media, specifically online, there is a large body of high quality information that is trapped behind paywalls. Would removing these barriers or finding alternative methods to fund these papers be a good first step in reducing the amount of bullshit that people consume? And what alternatives would you provide? That's a great question.
Yes. Jonas, do you want to?
Sure. All in favor, and this is happening already in some countries in Europe, for example, where basically if you get a state-funded research project, you have to make the publications open access, right? And I think that's more reasonable. That basically, if tax money goes into research, that basically the taxpayers should also be able to read it. So I think, yeah, absolutely, right? I think nobody likes these pay $39 for this research paper. In the second step, I don't think it would necessarily help us, right? I think we've seen this in the last 3 years, more like 2 years, where basically most publishers were making all the publications on COVID open access, right? And I don't think this actually contributed to less bullshit in the ecosystems, but rather, I think that's not the reason, but because a lot of people were just cherry picking statistics from papers, basically twisting the message of the papers in favor of whatever they wanted to say. And so that's obviously a potential side effect, but I don't think that's necessarily the result of that. I don't, however, think that basically making this open access will suddenly help us from bullshit.
There might be independent reasons to support open access, but
yes.
I wish there was rare access. You have a paywall for so many institutions, and that's their way of surviving. Of course, and I think they should be open. MIT, for example, had a case of forgetting the young man's name.
Aaron Swartz?
I'm sorry?
Aaron Swartz?
Aaron Swartz, exactly. Where the information, he was trying to make information public in order to, for purpose of elucidation. And as we know, this young man ended up taking his life, the Aaron Swartz case. I was able, after we just had this discussion about fire and open, calling fire in the theater, I was able to go to Atlantic because I have a subscription, or to The Economist because I have two publications that I have a lot of faith in that do really good fact checking, and found the very point that you were making. Oliver Wendell Holmes made the analogy during a controversial Supreme Court case that was overturned more than 40 years later. Everyone should have that access to that type of information. It's far more reliable than going, for example, to Wikipedia. Though Wikipedia can be a good source, this is far better because you have editors. You have people who check these things, who work on this type of information. This is a simple example, but I'm all open. I'm all for more open access.
Tina, do you have thoughts for this, or should we go for one more question?
On this, I would also agree that it would be nice to have open access. However, there are commercial reasons where these organizations have to make money, and they need to have this kind of subscription. So I don't think that, and I agree with Jonas that we've seen that even when you do have open access, some people will simply not go there because it just doesn't, they don't want that kind of analysis. And what we see more and more, and that's something I think is interesting for this audience, we hear more and more about the phenomenon of news avoidance, especially by young people, where they don't want to read about the news. The news is too negative, too depressing. They feel helpless towards all these crises or things that they read. And so that also points to the fact that even with open access, I don't think necessarily those who we want to get more educated and to read more widely would do that. They would just simply get their news from TikTok, like my kids sometimes do. So that doesn't augur very well for the news organizations.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think we have to go to closing comments from our panelists now. We have 15 minutes?
We have 15 more minutes.
Oh, okay, my run of show. Okay, great, we have 15 more minutes. Okay, so Sun, do you want to ask your question? Great, okay.
Hi, my name is Sana. I'm a part of Rachel's class. I just wanted to know if there have ever been times where you felt that bullshit was necessary, or you felt that it's always a bad thing. Can there be times where the use of bullshit may be for the greater good?
No. No, I think even if it's at the risk of being wrong, and I was wrong, for example, on the crying fire in a crowded theater, even at the risk of being wrong, truth is like, I mean, it's not something that you can compromise on, because ultimately it really, I think it really destroys the case that you're making in the broader sense. If you're whether you're a journalist or a teacher or a doctor or professor or whatever, truth is, you can have that one battle where you just won, like by telling a lie, but it smears the entire project if you go in that direction. So I think the answer is emphatically no. That bullshit, I cannot see it being advantageous in any way, shape, form, or fashion. And I'm trying to think of examples. For example, I have one. Let's hear it.
All right. Well, like from a medical perspective, let's say there was a doctor who had to tell a family that a loved one had very little time and they were going to die. Now, there's a way of saying it where you're like, this person is going to experience excruciating pain, which is the truth. Or you can say, because let's say they're in a coma, they're fine, they're okay. That's bullshit. That's complete bullshit. You know that person is going through pain, but the family will never know that. So to save the family from that pain, isn't it wiser in that sense, seeing as they'll never know and the person will have no opportunity to tell?
I mean, that's paternalistic. We went like...
It might be paternalistic, but it's still an argument.
Well, but it's deceptive, and it seems to be undermining their autonomy, and we'll talk more in class, but it seems like there are good reasons not to do it, right? But I don't know, Jonas and Tina, I mean, do you have thoughts on other cases for bullshit to be justified, or what do you think?
Quick answer, no.
Well, this last example was more what I would call a white lie. I wouldn't call it bullshit because the intention is not carelessness towards truth. It's just trying to kind of lighten the suffering. No, I think that if you go down that route at any time and you dismiss truth and you just use bullshit for whatever reason you undermine your own authority. And then next time you're going to say something, it's very likely that some people are going to see right through it and see that it is bullshit. So I think it's a very slippery line to go down on, and I would never do it, and I definitely make sure that we never do it in our job, even when we don't have all the data or if we don't have all the information. We try to be as accurate as possible, and that's where our the authority of an organization like the European Union depends on that, on being accurate and not kind of putting bullshit out. So we prefer to keep it this way.
So we have a panel of Kantians versus a consequentialist, is what I'm hearing. Do we have time for one more question? Yes. Okay. So we have time for one more question from the audience. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sophie. I'm also a master's student in the Global Public Policy degree. I have a question for any of the panelists, but what Philip has been saying has what's made me think of this. How do we combat or move forward with people who choose to deny facts that are like global warming or like climate change, the COVID pandemic? How do we move forward in conversations with people who just choose not to believe it or, deny it?
It's a good question, and I think you answered it. You move forward, and think about the climate change argument when you're all very young, but when I started hearing this about maybe 30 years ago, that the climate was changing irreparably unless we did X, Y, and Z. You actually had at that time what they called a debate over climate change, where some scientists, not a majority, but some scientists were saying, well, no, there's no reason to believe that humans contribute to the decline in our climate, in the changes in our climate, rather. This started, but the scientists with the continued pounding the information, moving forward, data point after data point after data point, to where you got to a point where the number of scientists, quote unquote, who believed that humans were contributing dramatically to the erosion to the changes in climate, and thus creating deleterious conditions and so on and so forth. That number started getting smaller and smaller. The number of doubters, as they called, until you had people who were, right now you have doubters, yes, but they aren't relying on, many of those doubters are no longer relying on facts, what they call facts, what they call data. And because the data showing climate change as a danger and as being problematic, and that we're in the midst of it, it's greater than the lie. And far more persuasive, where even people who believed that climate change was mythology and did not, their numbers just started decreasing. You see this even within the fossil fuel industry, where but many come up with alternate ways of addressing climate change while accepting that there's climate change. Some are now suggesting that there are alternate ways of dealing with climate change, though we're in the midst of it. Is that helpful? Yes. Excellent.
Yeah. Tina, and then Jonas.
Yeah, no, I think this was a good example, but somehow you have to also accept that there are some people who you'll never convince or you'll never have them change their mind. So I think this is already something to bear in mind. But to determine whether that's the case, I think the idea is that you need to dig a little bit deeper into why people hold those ideas or beliefs, and get a little bit deeper into the values. And only by showing empathy and keep having this conversation and offering some alternative views, because it wouldn't be a good idea to say, you're stupid for believing that the Earth is flat, but to provide some other alternative, let's say, story to replace the erroneous beliefs that they have. So this is the only way, but also to be not to feel bad that if you can't change people's minds, it's a really difficult thing, and it can take many years, as Philip said, and a lot of evidence to do that in a very systematic way. And repetition is, for any good communicator, the only way that you can actually get something across, if at all.
Right. Just to add to those two excellent responses, my sense is that if you kind of like want to combat disinformation, you kind of like have to first acknowledge that you won't solve it, right? Like, so the falsehoods in themselves are out there, but they're out there for a reason, and it's kind of like more important to understand why they're there, right? Like climate change, for example, is a good example, because there are such vested interests in kind of like keeping the current system of our economy going that profits off kind of like, destroying the climate, right? Like, and so it's more important to understand that and then basically think about like political responses to that, right? Like, how can we actually incentivize, for example, renewable energy sources? How can we incentivize individual, behaviors and all of those things on the one hand? And on the other, call out bullshit whenever you can, but, like also invest in journalism, invest in local journalism, right? Like, because, for example, in the US, but that is true more or less in most countries, that local journalism is kind of like the most trusted, journalism out there. And it's also going away in the US with news deserts and all of those things. But like, if you want bipartisan debates around topics that people care about, invest in local journalism.
Great. So one last question. So my class has lots of thoughts on this because we're using this in our class. This is from online. How do you think that AI, like ChatGPT, will impact the prevalence of BS? So Jonas, do you want to start with this?
Sure. I think, as with all technologies, it can be abused, and it will be abused, and it is already being abused, be that by students for their papers, or by people that use it kind of like to flood the zone, as Tina said earlier, on social media platforms, or to write fake news articles on like fake news websites. And I think, again, the key part when it comes to technologies like machine learning models, when it comes to deepfakes and all of that, is kind of like how we as society choose to respond to that, and how we choose to kind of like use it, how we choose to kind of like, deal with content that is online. And if we basically treat everything as real, if we treat everything as kind of like, that's kind of like what the reality is, then we're having an issue. If we kind of like treat it as one of the many ways bullshit comes our way, and if you kind of like engage in skepticism, and if you're kind of like aware of what's out there and how that can be used, then I think we should be more or less fine.
Yeah, okay, great. Tina?
Yeah, I think Jonas said it all. We just have to treat it like every other channel, and know that it has an unlimited potential to create individual stories for everyone and target them depending on what makes them more angry or what makes them more happy. And as long as we're aware that this is there, like deep fakes, because in fact people believe more visual information than written information, and ChatGPT AI has the potential to do both. So awareness, that's the only, and a critical eye, and knowing that not everything. I understand even some there were some tests of questions to AI legal questions, and they were hallucinating, as it's called, making the answers up. And I don't think it was intentional either. So some very strange things ahead of us.
So,
I think Joe said it all. I can't. I mean, it's a brave new world, and it's frightening in the sense that you can create the most convincing argument over a lie with. But I guess one advantage may perhaps of GPS is that what
GPT.
GPT. I don't use it. One advantage is that if you can, I'm assuming that the algorithms largely work on gathering truthful elements.
everything.
Everything. Then I could only say that that it's problematic, and that both Jonas and Tina summed it up as far as I'm concerned. I don't know enough about it, but I'm concerned about it.
So I'm going to ask our panelists now to give their closing remarks really briefly. Maybe let's do like the Twitter version, really brief, like 140 characters. So Tina, do you want to give your closing remarks on bullshit? What do you think?
Sure. So I think for bullshit, we need what we call a whole of society approach. So there's a role for governments, there's a role for media, for companies that are making money out of it, and there's a role for every one of us to be much more attentive and critical to what we see. But then again, not be too distrustful of everything, because that will lead you down rabbit holes and conspiracy theories. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much.
Yes, so very quick, and I'm just repeating what I've said before, but basically, don't focus on the messages, right? Don't focus on the bullshit, focus on the people who spread it. That is much more important and much more, you'll learn much more about that and kind of like how it's being used. Because you won't, if you engage with bullshit, if you call bullshit every time, you'll always lose. Right, and so it's much more important to understand where and in what context it's being used and for what purpose. And on an individual level, be cautious, be critical, never stop learning, because as we can like see, for example, with ChatGPT, right, like everybody's calling it AI, hint, it's not intelligence.
I would say, again, trust your own eyes, trust the data, look at varied data, and I think there should be greater cooperation and collaboration between historians, journalists, and others who basically work on promulgating and seeking truth. An example might be the lost cause is something that's still echoed in our society widely, that slavery was not the reason for the Civil War. Well, that's nonsense. That's a lie. And we still hear that the lost cause is something that is the reason for the Civil War. And that becomes an example of something that has to be dismantled in our society, because it leads directly to a skewed version, for example, of our entire history, and not understanding against structures such as systemic racism in the formation, again, of the evolution of the country. It becomes important that we cooperate as communities, again, journalists, historians, doctors, everyone come together basically in the name of truth.
That's great. So let's thank our speakers.